Good morning, everybody. And thank you all for finding your way. It was an intellectual challenge, I realize, but you're all here, so that shows you're really smart people, and you're smart because you came to this important discussion today. I want to thank you all for being here, including our wonderful panelists you're going to hear. I'd like to tell you something about the League. There are many people here who are not members. In fact, perhaps more who are not members than who are members, thanks to the Bee's publicity, and we're really happy about that. But I want to tell you three things about the League of Women Voters that you probably don't know. First of all, despite the name, it's not for men. It's not for women only. We have many men members. About 17% of our members are men, and we have several of them here today. Secondly, the League is not just about government, voting, and legislation. That's one very large umbrella that we have, but we have two other umbrellas as well, and one is natural resources. And Mary Savala, raise your hand. Can't find you. There she is. And she's our vice president in charge of natural resources, which includes water, energy, dairies, air, solar, nuclear, anything you can think of that's out there. And that's a very, very important umbrella. And the third umbrella is social policy, which includes everything else in the world. And Kay Burtkin, who's in charge of education, is sitting in the back there, and she does a wonderful job with that. My husband, sitting in the front here, who's covering this for our newsletter, tells me I should tell you that I'm Francine Farber. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters, and I'm very happy to be here today. I have one more thing to say, and that is I need to explain to you what we're doing here today exactly, so you understand this very large thing that you're a part of. There's a United States League of Women Voters and a California League of Women Voters. There's one in each state. And then there are many local leagues of women voters, just like the Fresno one. And the California League of Women Voters is undertaking a study of their current position on the initiative and referendum process. They want to determine whether they should maintain their current position, whether they should alter it in some way, delete some things, add some things, throw out the whole shebang, whatever. So in order to do that, they're asking local leagues to study it themselves, just as we're beginning to do today. And you know we have another meeting with different panelists on February 25th. So we are going to study it by having panelists bring their points of view to us, and we have the opportunity to ask them questions. We're going to write it up in our newsletter, send it out to all our members. We're going to have a second meeting to do the same thing. And then on March, I believe it's 16th, members only will be invited to come to a consensus meeting where those questions that you have, that you should have picked up at the front door, will be answered. And when our league answers them, if in fact our league reaches a consensus on those questions, we will send that consensus info up to the state league, as will other leagues from all over California. And the state league will review those, and they will decide whether there's a statewide consensus on each of those questions. And if there is, they will then come out with their study position on the initiative and referendum process. So it's a very long, complicated process that you are a part of, and you're welcome to look at the questions and to answer them. It's just that we can't count them as part of the study unless you are a member. So, to help you, oh, I am so glad you asked. At the front desk, there's one of these folders, and on the back, there's a very uncomplicated membership form, which asks you to give us your contact info, and if you're an individual, $60. If you're a couple, $90, and that gives you all the rights and privileges of membership for a year, including a monthly newsletter and invitations to other special events. So we hope you will pick this up, open your wallet or your checkbook, and become a member here. Now I'd like to turn it over to Liz Shields, who's our vice president in charge of our biggest umbrella, and that is voter services. Thank you.
Thank you, Francine. Just one housekeeping detail before I talk about the panelists. Restrooms out through the back door and a rather complicated zigzag pattern. Good point, good point. Well, I'd just like to say again, welcome, and I'd like to introduce our panelists, and I'll introduce them in the order in which they're going to speak. First of all, we have Dr. David Schecter, who's sitting in the middle there. He is in the political science department at Fresno State. He came to Fresno in 2001. Having got his PhD in political science from the University of Florida. He's currently chair of the political science department, and I believe he's also finishing up an MBA in the executive MBA program. So a very busy person, and we really appreciate him being willing to take the time to come today. His main research areas are American politics, political behavior, and state and local politics. And he's found some very interesting connections between ballot initiatives and voter turnout that maybe he'll share with you. He's also had first-hand experience in politics in Fresno because he served as a campaign manager for Mayor Ashley Swearinger back in 2008. So again, thank you for coming. Our second speaker will be Justice James Ardaiz, who began his legal career in Fresno as a deputy district attorney back in 1974, and then became a judge in the county municipal court, county superior court, and then he was appointed to the Court of Appeals in 1988. He became the presiding justice in 1994, and he oversaw the construction and the transition of the court to the new Court of Appeals, that lovely building down on Ventura Street. He retired from the court in January of 2011, and now he spends his time teaching and lecturing and writing books. So as we know that there are many propositions end up in the court system due to disputes about the intention of the proposition or constitutional standings. For example, Proposition 8 on gay marriage is now in front of the US Supreme Court. So we asked Justice Ardaiz if he would talk about that connection between the role of the courts in the initiative process. And then the third person will be Mark Paul, who has written extensively about California policy and politics for over 3 decades. He began his newspaper career as an editorial page editor for the Oakland Tribune, and for 19 years was on the editorial staff of the Sacramento Bee, where he won the 2000 Best in the West award for his editorials on the Gray Davis administration. He's also served as a deputy treasurer for the state of California and policy director for the gubernatorial campaign of Phil Angelides back in 2006. Now, recently, he has co-authored a book with Joe Matthews called California Crackup, in which he makes a very convincing argument for the role of the initiative process in the breakdown of governance in California. And he makes recommendations for reversing that trend. He has brought copies of his book, and we will hold a book signing at the end of this event. So first of all, let me ask Dr. Schecter to come up and speak about the whole initiative process.
Thank you very much, Liz. And I wasn't sure how the room was going to be arranged, so I have about 15 slides, and some of them you may have to squint a little bit, so I apologize for that. But I'll try and explain each one. And then I'm going to set my, my clock here for 15, 20 minutes and ask Liz to give me the hook when we need to lead us to our next speaker. And I just want to thank the League as well for asking me to participate today, and let's get going. So my charge was to talk about some history. So what I wanted to do was just tee things up by talking about the history of the initiative and referendum process, laying that groundwork, and then talking a little bit about the history in California as well. And then I'll raise a couple points, as Liz mentioned, the issue of voter turnout and the initiative and referendum and some other things, because it is such a large topic. I thought I'll just cherry pick a couple of items that might be of interest to the group and sort of lay that groundwork about the political history. So we have one state to blame for all of this. It's the great state of South Dakota. If I gave you a quiz, would you have guessed South Dakota as the first state in the Union to adopt the initiative and referendum? And they did so in 1898. But keep in mind, this is part of the larger progressive movement. So at the time, if you remember, the progressive movement is very interested in sort of running democracies in a way that they felt the state legislatures were not running. They felt the state legislatures were corrupt. They felt the state legislatures in states like ours in California were owned by the railroads and other entities. So the initiative and referendum was a way to go around those legislatures and allow for more democracy with people to be able to vote as they wish on items. And if you look at the root of those two words, initiate and refer, right? The initiative itself says the people can sign petitions and do whatever they need to in that state to initiate their own governance, their own policy that they want others to vote on. And then the root of the word referendum, refer, means the legislature actually then asks the voters to do something. But these are usually considered cousins, the initiative and referendum, along with the recall, which I'll talk about in 2 seconds. I've spent the most time researching the recall itself, but even though that's not the topic today, I'll hit on it a little bit in just a second. So from South Dakota, you've got to understand that at the time when these progressive changes were going on, the initiative and referendum was just one of many tools in the tool chest for the progressive movement. And they were also interested in nonpartisan ballots. They were also interested in cleaning up the election process, giving women the right to vote. But if you look at the age of some of the leaders at that time, it sort of gives you an indication of how important the initiative and referendum was for folks at the turn of the century. La Follette of Wisconsin was 45, Woodrow Wilson was 44, Brandeis 44, Teddy Roosevelt 42, W.J. Bryan 40. These were all young, up-and-coming political folks who were interested in their particular state having the initiative, referendum, recall, and other progressive movements as part of what they were doing to change government. They felt their representatives were corrupt at the time, most of them. So what is the growth pattern that took place? Well, there's, we could go through lots of maps showing how this sort of played itself out over the first decade, but the initiative and referendum was adopted in 22 states between 1898 and 1918. So there was a 2-decade spurt there where almost all the states that have the initiative and referendum today put it into their constitution. So that's pretty much the growth pattern. Some of you are writing notes, by the way. I'm happy to send these to anyone. If you want to give me your email at the end or something, I'm happy to send you these so you don't have to write. When Oklahoma joined the Union in 1907, it was the first state to do so with direct democracy provisions already in its original constitution. And as we'll talk about, there is some variation in the initiative itself and the referendum itself. They can vary depending on how a state wants to configure it within their constitution. And then the first state to vote on a proposition was actually Oregon in 1904. So this is a movement that's a little more than 100 years old. It burst onto the scene 1898. It grew and kind of went like wildfire through a series of states in about a 20-year period, and then most states didn't adopt it. So the only state who's adopted it since that growth period is Louisiana. So those states who put it on the books 100 years ago put it on the books. Those who don't have it haven't put it on the books, is the easiest way to think about it. So in California, there were 23 charter amendments that were considered for the state constitution and updating the state constitution on the special election ballot in October of 1911. So the interesting thing about this is the governor at the time, Hiram Johnson, is also a young progressive and very interested in changing things up in Sacramento, also upset about how the legislature was doing certain things. The Los Angeles Times editorialized in opposition on the morning of the vote. I'm going to show you a funny quote of theirs in just a second. So just because the initiative and referendum was supported by the governor, now think about that for 1 second, right? If you're a governor and you have problems with the legislature, don't you want the initiative and referendum too? So it's a weapon, it's a tool that's been used by some of these governors over time. Despite these pleas for the LA Times and other leaders in the state back then, the women's suffrage vote passes, the initiative passes, the referendum and the recall all passed. Now, the interesting thing about that is thinking about the LA Times itself. I cut down the quote as much as I can, but you're going to love this quote. This is the LA Times on the morning of the vote on whether or not California should have the initiative, the referendum, the recall, and women's suffrage. The whole situation is one of haste, of undue fanatical eagerness to have the work approved before it's been studied. Women's suffrage should be defeated because it tends to unsex society and destroy the home. I just want to let that sink in for a sec because it's so good. The initiative and referendum should be defeated because they are instruments of the turbulent few, and their adoption means recurrent elections of frivolous character. The recall should be defeated because it makes official and judicial cowards and destroys stability and independence. Okay, so the leading newspaper at the time said no to all of these entities. Don't those quotes kind of sound familiar, though? Isn't that some of the same criticism you hear today about the initiative and referendum, and people have taken it over and hijacked it and all this kind of stuff? So the same arguments we hear today, you heard 100 years ago, almost verbatim, you know? It's kind of like, to me, every generation thinks they're living through the time of the nastiest political campaigns, right? During every political season, people say, this is the year, it's never been nastier than this year. But if you go back, in U.S. history and in state of California history, we've had some really nasty elections. So every generation thinks they're living through the worst of the worst. But I share this quote as an idea to sort of give you a hint of what it was like 100 years ago when they were battling over whether to have it to begin with. So here's your quiz question for today. The first ballot question in California that the California voters saw was A, what did I pick? Oh yeah, taxes. B, park spending. You can rule that one out, right? That's easy. C, railroads, dealing with the railroads. Or D, the very important issue of horse track wagering. All in favor of A? All in favor of B? C? D, okay, yeah, right. So what was the first thing that California's dealt with when they had the option to use that powerful initiative and referendum to go get at government? They dealt with horse track wagering. And gambling and what we call morality issues in the literature has been a thread throughout the initiative and referendum's history. Issues about what we would call sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Things about morality, things about gambling, things about, we've seen it with Indian gaming initiatives in the last few years. This is a thread that's gone through California history for quite a while. So this is what the map looks like today. The red states are the initiative and popular referendum states. The yellow states have some popular referendum only, and if we need to during Q&A, we can go into the details or differences on those. The green states are initiative with constitutional amendments only, and the key here is thinking about the states that were the progressive states that adopted the initiative and referendum, and many of the ballot questions that we see in the country today are in 3 or 4 states only. They're here, they're Oregon, they're the ones, Arizona, they're the ones that have had a lot of initiatives and referendum over time. And then how about the original 13 colonies? Were they interested in the referendum or initiative? Not really. They barely adopt at all, Massachusetts being pretty much the only one. Their government is structured as a representative government. They've kept it as a representative government, and they have had very little interest in adopting this beast of the initiative and referendum that you and I have to deal with. So historically, if you think about it, the country is really divided on the initiative and referendum itself. So if you want to think about it that way, you can start to see that this is not something that has swept the whole country, but has been very prevalent for us. And then the issue that was near and dear to me, and I did my dissertation on this in 2000, was the question of, if you have the initiative and referendum, does that lower or increase turnout? What's the relationship between the initiative and referendum and turnout? And I was sort of puzzled by this question. There were a number of political scientists considering things at the same time. All this table shows you is a sort of simple breakdown from the 70s going all the way up through the 90s. And the dark line is turnout in the initiative states. The dotted line is turnout in the non-initiative states. So if I ask the simple question, do those states that have the initiative and referendum have higher political participation, higher turnout? The answer is yes. Now there's many variables that sort of have to factor in to this same equation. One thing includes whether it's a presidential year or a congressional year, but one of the things that the league has been charged with is what's the relationship between the initiative and referendum and turnout. And as we'll see in a few minutes, in many ways it can drive turnout, having these things on the ballot. Now it might not drive the turnout you like, or the people that you want to have come to the polls for something, but it is sort of correlated pretty heavily with higher turnout and higher political participation in California and elsewhere. So if we look at a couple of quick tables here very quickly, what you'll see, and this is a little too complicated to show in a room like this, so I apologize, because it's got some sort of tiny font and tiny print on it. When we look at what Californians have voted on, what you're seeing here is categories of ballot initiatives in California for almost 100 years. So from 1912 to 1989, what did we vote on? What kind of stuff was on the ballot that was an initiative and referendum for us to consider? And I ranked it here by the percentage of voter turnout levels. So it's really not necessarily just turnout in the classic sense of turnout, but this is showing what percentage of the people who went to the poll that day voted on that issue. Now, the reason that that's important, especially for something like the League of Women Voters, is when people are going to the polls, there's something called drop-off occurring. Drop-off means, I'll vote for this one, I'll vote for this one I don't really understand, I'm not going to vote for it at all. So there is a sense when voters do go to the polls, they don't vote for every single thing in front of us. We're all guilty of doing that, right? Even on some city council races sometimes and some local initiatives. So historically, when you look at the number of initiatives that have been on the ballot, there's been about 200 on the ballot, 202 in this period. The voters have been asked to consider all kinds of public policies. They've been asked to consider government transfer issues, money changing hands between the levels of government, discrimination, obscenity, religion, and rights. That's a big category. Environmental and consumer regulation, alcohol and narcotics issues, gambling, racing, and sports book. And as you can see, what we call those morality issues in the literature make up the top 5 categories here, right? They're always being asked about some sort of religious issue, gambling issue, racing, sports. And then the more boring ones that are much more difficult even for everyone to understand, business and labor regulation, taxes, election procedures, government administration, we've been asked about, not as many times in single digits as we've been asked about these other issues, but it does give you a sense for what the public has had to deal with over 100 years, and do you have a comfort level, are you okay with the public making decisions in these areas, because that's the areas that we've asked to sort of look into things. And as you can see, there's pretty considerable drop-off, right? On the morality issues, people pretty much have an opinion and they're gonna vote. And then the opposition also pretty much has an opinion and is gonna vote. So you see higher levels of participation on those questions than you do on things like, government administration, government powers and procedures, which may not draw out both sides or become sort of a war in terms of participation. And then here is a ballot that looks a lot like the 2012 ballot. You remember the one we just had in November? In other words, people care about these issues and have cared about them for decades. So what I'm trying to sort of build up is a picture of a process that's 100 years old, but that people have been dealing with kind of the same topics for so long. So should that right be taken away? Let's think about that. Here's the 1972 ballot. So I picked a couple just sort of at random just to take a look at. It's really deja vu all over again. So this is a ballot from 40 years ago. What was the #1 sort of issue that people voted on 40 years ago? Marijuana decriminalization. Is this sounding familiar? #2, obscenity regulations. #3, death penalty, right? And what did we have on our ballot this November? We had 2 questions about crime and death penalty issues, okay? So the voters have been kind of redoing it almost, if you want to think about these things. They've been judging topics during the initiative and referendum voting process, then 20, 30, 40 years later, they look at it again. Sometimes they liberalize it, sometimes they make it more conservative, but they've been dealing with these kinds of issues for a long time. And as you can see, there's a lot of participation on those compared with some of the other ones that were on the ballot 40 years ago. And if you take away the initiative and referendum process, you would be taking away, in a sense, the voters' rights to participate on those. And then bouncing around, looking at the 2006 election, I just picked 2 here, the 1972 and 2006. What were the voters dealing with that year? Well, cigarette taxes, abortion politics, of course, and then public education facilities bonds, education funding. Does this ring a bell? Because these are the same issues that were also on our ballot this last year, like with Prop 30. So again, the California voters have been reviewing and re-reviewing these processes for many, many, many years, no matter what snapshot in time you look at, and that's important. And then lastly, if we reform ours, the question that I wanted to ask the group today is, what will that mean for other states and for the citizens of those states? And our first response might be, well, so whatever Arizona's doing or whatever Oregon is doing. But when we look at the initiatives and referendums that they deal with, and I just picked 2 ballots just for consideration, what you'll see is they're dealing with the hot button issues too. And eventually they're going to come to our state one way or the other. They either come to our state through Congress doing things or other states doing things. And just like the initiative and referendum took off like a brush fire over a 20-year period, these same topics take off too. So here's an Arizona ballot from the 90s. Again, an issue that's near and dear to California politics: gaming pacts with Indian tribes, prosecuting juveniles, increased salaries of legislators, all those kinds of things. And then I just noted the turnout here, that unfortunately in races for judge and stuff, not too many people ever participate in these. It's just how it's been. That's an Arizona ballot. And then look at Oregon. What did they deal with in the late 90s? This is, again, deja vu all over again for us. They're dealing with medical marijuana uses, penalties for marijuana possession, lottery funds for parks, beaches, and recreations. So when you look at a list of what other states are dealing with, these are all issues that have a constituency that are near and dear to certain people, and they're dealing with them. So if California chooses to continue participating with the initiative and referendum, that's fine. We'll just be partnering with these other states who have been dealing with it. If we decide to reform it or moderate or pull out, then these other states would be doing this, and is that good or bad for us? It's just a judgment call that I think we should think about. So having said that, I'd be happy to answer questions during the Q&A about any of the history. I just went through a sort of flyover of some points, and would be happy to answer any of the historical stuff if I can when we hit that point. So turn it over to Mark.
Liz, did you want me to stand and? As I wish. All right. I don't know if everybody, it's probably easier than if I stand up so that people can see me. Well, my subject's a little bit different, and it has to do with the way the courts respond to initiatives. I've had the opportunity personally to review 2 initiatives as they came up. One was the marijuana initiative. I'm not holding the mic close enough to my face. Okay. Well, I'm sorry. I tend to do 2 things when I'm talking. I tend to pace, and I tend to move my arms. So not wildly. All right. Let me just say, I was listening to the presentation, and I thought how little has changed. And we talked about the initiative process and why it was developed, and the public's concern about special interests controlling the legislature. And I thought, so what's different now, almost 100 years later? Not much. When we look at initiatives, and as they come up to the court system, you have to understand what the responsibility is of judges with relationship to initiatives. It's not the responsibility of judges to make interpretations or determinations based upon whether they think an initiative is good social policy or anything else. So it becomes very limited in terms of what they do as it relates to review. You really look at an initiative in stages, and as they come up, the first thing is whether or not it is accurately presented in terms of the synopsis of the initiative. There's really not much more that judges do other than reacting to that. That's a fairly controlled process in terms of how that is done with respect to those that are looking at it. If anything should be looked at, in my view, with respect to initiatives, it is to ensure that the description on the initiative is actually accurate and unbiased and not generated by a particular agenda. And we do have that happening with respect to initiatives and the characterizations of them, and they can be very misleading, because I would hazard a guess that virtually no one in this room except a complete political junkie actually reads everything that's in an initiative in the ballot when you get it. You look at the beginning of it, you look at the top, you look at the description, and you react to that, and a lot of times that isn't particularly accurate in and of itself. So when you're passing initiatives that have tremendous consequences, either from a tax standpoint or from a social standpoint, it's not really clear why certain things are or are not happening. But let me make a point with respect to initiatives. I've always been a person who has a great deal of respect for the initiative process because I have a great deal of respect for the democratic process. I understand that initiatives can be passed that create a lot of problems, but that doesn't mean that I necessarily think that that process should be taken away from the people or limited. Generally, I think the initiative process reacts to failings with respect to the legislature, or in some cases when we look at, for example, the most controversial initiative that we've had in the last number of years, Prop 8, with respect to, for example, gay marriage, reaction to things that are done by judges who have a tremendous amount of power in terms of their interpretation. So when an initiative comes up, you look at things like the breadth of the initiative, and we have something called the single subject rule. Theoretically, an initiative should only cover one subject so that people are really only addressing one particular policy or social or economic or legal issue. But that's interpreted so broadly that for all intents and purposes, the single subject rule does not have any effect whatsoever with respect to an initiative. I mean, it's interpreted almost as broadly as this is an initiative about crime. Well, fine. I mean, so we know how broad that is. Where we start to run into problems with initiatives is not so much in terms of the initiative itself, it's the implementation process. That's where we start to look at things like, well, what does this mean? And you get into rules of interpretation. And you have to understand that when judges interpret initiatives, they interpret it like a statute. So they look at it and they look at the regular meaning of rules and words. And they look at it from the standpoint of attempting to uphold it. They do not look at it from the standpoint of attempting to undermine or reverse it. So they bend over backwards to uphold the initiative if they possibly can. And when they run into irreconcilable or what might be regarded or argued as irreconcilable positions, they attempt to reconcile them as best they can. And if they can't, then they look at the purpose and the spirit of the initiative to attempt to ensure what was really meant by it. So there becomes a high degree of interpretation. What they do not do is they do not go behind the policy of the initiative. So they don't get into the factual aspects of it. When you look at a law that is passed, generally speaking, and you may not believe me when I say this, but theoretically, there has to be a reason for the law. And there has to be a factual basis for the law. But judges don't go behind that factual basis because there's differences of opinions as to facts and what is a good reason or a bad reason for passing an initiative. And you really don't want judges going behind that and making determinations as to whether or not there is substantial evidence to support the facts, because that becomes a subjective determination. And that's what we saw with respect to Proposition 8 and the problems that occurred with respect to that. And as a judge, I was particularly concerned whenever I saw Proposition 8 being evaluated in a trial courtroom, and we got into issues of the factual assumptions that existed behind it, and judges making a judge making a determination as to those factual assumptions. Now, I'm not saying that the assumptions are necessarily right or wrong. I'm simply pointing out that if you allow judges to make factual determinations as to whether certain assumptions are or are not true, what happens is in the review process, the judge's determination becomes the determination. It becomes the opinion of a judge as opposed to an opinion of a larger group of people that may agree or disagree. And this creates significant problems. So I was very surprised in Proposition 8, for example, going behind the actual process to have evidence on whether certain things or assumptions are true or are not true. There's a big distinction between that and constitutional interpretations as to whether something should or should not be constitutional, which is a much broader question. we run into problems with respect to when we're evaluating the process with respect to social interpretation. As was pointed out, a lot of these initiatives involve significant moral questions or public questions or social questions, and people have very strong feelings about those things. It's not the function of judges to insert themselves into that. That's a bad thing, because it really is their obligation, whether they like it or not. And a lot of times I heard judges over the years as an appellate court judge where they would look at initiatives and say, I just can't believe people voted for this. And then whenever we would have the vote as to how we were going to rule on it, we'd say, well, we're going to uphold it. I mean, if that's what they want to do, that's their business. So, and that's really what you want. You really don't want judges saying, I disagree with that, and I have the power, I'm going to fix it, and I'm going to change it. And that's where you start to run into a problem. Now, when we ran into issues like, for example, a number of years ago, we had what I think at the time, I get lost in all the proposition numbers, I think it was Prop 36, the drug diversion statutes that were generated by, frankly, by out-of-state special interests. And we ended up with operational issues with respect to the court, and people being asked to essentially vote on procedural issues with respect to court operations with no idea of what happens with respect to dealing with people who are drug offenders. It's a highly specific type of caseload, and it requires highly trained enforcement, and people reacted as a matter of social policy. But what they did was, in effect, impose upon the courts a complete lack of ability to deal with drug problems, which was not the intended result, and it's very difficult to change. The other argument that we see, of course, has to do when we get into social policy, regardless of what it may be, whether it's marriage or drugs or anything else, we get into issues of equal protection and constitutional arguments. So judges really try to refrain from that. And when we talk about some of the questions that have been raised today, and I was looking at issues that you have to address, things like what should happen at the front end? Well, first of all, if you had a process that allowed judges to go through and evaluate and required that they evaluate the constitutionality of everything that was in an initiative, I can assure you right now, well, if we look at Prop 8, how many years ago was Prop 8 that came out? 4 years ago. 4 years ago. And the process was initiated, what, 5 years ago? And it still hasn't been heard by the United States Supreme Court. So if we were going to put judges at the front end of that, I can tell you right now, nothing would get done. And maybe that's a good thing, but it's not a good thing for purposes of process. So I really disfavor the idea of judges involving themselves at the front end in terms of constitutionality and rules of interpretation. We don't do that now with the legislature. And frankly, I'm not sure that necessarily I see a big benefit. I mean, we look at the legislature and a lot of the laws that they pass, assuming initiatives take up 5% of our time, 95% of it is taken up by trying to interpret what the legislature did. So you need to think about that for a moment to realize that maybe it would be a good thing if we made everything they pass subject to judicial review, then we could make sure that nothing got done. I really think that in terms of the public's ability to react to matters of social policy, that we need to retain that process. We need to retain that voice. And I really think that if we were to do anything with respect to it, I would favor something that attempts to clarify what the purpose is as an educational device, and so that people could see what they were really voting for in terms of its objectives. And it would be very narrow. We look at what just happened, for example, in California with respect to the three strikes law, for example. And people reacting to that. Many people thought that they were voting to make it stronger when they were actually voting to make it weaker. And they didn't understand precisely what the consequence was. Now, you could agree or disagree with that in terms of the consequence and what you think of the three strikes law, but my point is you should clearly understand what the impact is going to be when you vote for it. You don't have to read all of the fine print behind it, and you really need people that are going to make that evaluation that are neutral. And so I do favor taking that out of the political process and putting it into a more neutral process in terms of its evaluation. Because it is, to a certain extent, agenda-driven and political when we look at how those interpretations are placed before the people. So, generally speaking, the difficulty that I have always found in terms of initiatives, and the last one I did was the marijuana initiative. We're still talking about the marijuana initiative. There were all kinds of issues that were raised with that. What constitutes a medicinal quantity of marijuana? Well, now we found out that you can have 75 plants, which is enough to make 8,000 joints and, you know, whatever it is, and theoretically that's a medicinal quantity. Well, I guess it is if you want to be comatose for a year. But, you know, we end up with these ridiculous interpretations. If you just want to make marijuana legal, then make marijuana legal. This is the kind of thing, and I don't think anybody intended for that, but it's very difficult to unwind that, very difficult to change that. But again, I am a person, having been a judge for 30 years, that really favors very narrow judicial review of the public process. I don't care what it is. I really think that the public voice needs to be maintained, and that judges really need to play a very narrow role, particularly in the inception of it. And then afterwards, well, judges will have to interpret it, and that's fine. And that process hasn't been so bad. It's messy. It hasn't been so bad. But the countervailing aspect of it would be to take it away. And I don't think that that's a good thing either. So I tend to look at it as it's a process that needs to be preserved. I mean, it can be tweaked a little bit, but I certainly don't think that we should go back and reinvent the process. I think we should address maybe narrow aspects of it where we found we have a problem. So that's my thinking, and I would be happy to respond to any questions you might have from a legal or judicial perspective. Yes? The question is, do referenda ever end up in court? Well, we haven't really discussed the referendum process, but the answer is yes, they do. So, and we've seen it at a number of different levels. There's constitutional questions as to what you can and cannot bring up by way of referendum, and it's a different process than an initiative. Is there a question back there? Okay, well, you want me to do that now? Sure. Okay. All right.
I have my own. Is this on? Yeah. I'd also like to thank the league for having me here. My partner and co-author of California Crackup, Joe Matthews, and I think now have talked to almost every league in the state of California. You've been our most avid audience for the suggestions that we've made for changing the initiative process. So I certainly appreciate you providing us with a forum to talk about these ideas. You know, as David said, we've been having the same argument about the initiative for 100 years. You know, it started before it was even put into law. And you know, as David said, the idea was that the legislatures were corrupt, were not responsive to the people's will, and that therefore people would take lawmaking into their own hands and change that. And so, after 100 years, you know, one might hypothesize that 100 years of the voters in California having the power to make laws on their own, that they would be pretty happy with their government in California. That doesn't seem to be the case, and so we continue to have this same argument. You know, who's to blame for California's problems? You know, is it those lawmakers who are beholden to special interests who never seem to be able to balance the budget or pass a budget on time, or is it the voters who, through the initiative process, which has been captured by special interests, have distorted governance in California, including by making the legislature more difficult for the legislature actually to do things? Because one of the things that we voters in California most like to do with the initiative process is to put into the Constitution and into law various sorts of mandates about taxes and spending and various sorts of processes of government, from Proposition 13 to, you know, the famous Jarvis-Gann tax initiative, to Prop 98, the famous school minimum funding guarantee that passed 10 years later in response to Prop 13. So, you know, the fact that we keep having this argument, and that there's never, neither side of the argument is ever a clear winner, you know, is precisely, we argue, the problem in California. The legislature and the voters each legislate. You know, they are part of the same branch of government, the legislative branch of the government. But the two halves of the branch, the people and the legislature through the people through the initiative and the legislature, are not really linked together in any sort of meaningful way. And so what we argue in California, Crackup, is what we needed to do in California is not just change the initiative, but to change the initiative and the legislature in ways that those two systems work together to complement each other rather than to fight each other. Hiram Johnson, who's the father of the initiative in California, more than 100 years ago, described that the initiative was going to be a gun in a man's hand. The progressives in California were unusually angry people. It was they were operating at a very angry time in California life. And for them, the initiative was going to be a tool for fighting. And what we really believe now is, after 100 years of fighting, is that what we need is to try to think about the process more, to take it back to its roots in Switzerland. And that the initiative is meant to be a tool of deliberation. That it could be an opportunity for a conversation. As David said, you know, the initiative comes from the word initiate. You know, it was meant as a way for voters to start a conversation. In California, the way we do our initiative, it doesn't start the conversation, it frequently ends the conversation, because California, our initiative process is unique in the world in that this is the only place in the world where measures, laws passed by initiative can't subsequently be changed after a period of time by the legislature without another vote of the people. That is, unless some initiatives actually allow the legislature to change their provisions, but many do not. And so the initiative in California is different than in most places because it creates a privileged class of law. Once it's very sticky. The decisions we make in California by initiative are very sticky and hard to change in response to conditions. Also, our initiative is inflexible on the front end. In California, unlike a lot of other states, in California, once you collect signatures and submit them for an initiative, you're locked in. You go automatically to the ballot. The initiative sponsor has no discretion about whether it goes to the ballot, which means that in California, initiative sponsors can't do what they do in other states, which is to qualify initiatives for the ballot and then go to the legislature and say, look at this. Voters want this subject dealt with. Can we cut a deal? Can we make this happen? That happens frequently. For instance, in Colorado, in recent years, a couple of major initiatives were not carried through on the ballot because the initiative sponsor was able to negotiate something very much like he wanted through with the governor and the legislature. In California, we don't have that. You know, what we do is once you sign the petitions, we have a fight, not a conversation. So in California Crackup, we offer, you know, a series of what we think of changes that we could make in the direct democracy process to make the process more of a conversation and to make what voters do through the ballot box adhere to many of the same rules that we ask the legislature to adhere to. So for instance, one of the things we have in California is that when we have laws, you know, our laws, you know, are drafted professionally by the Legislative Counsel's office in the legislature. Initiative process, anybody can draft his or her own law, and there's no oversight of that process in terms of whether or not what the measure is the drafts person actually writes is actually what the initiative is actually meant to do, which is why the courts frequently have to clear up some of these things. I mean, there are numerous examples of occasions where initiatives had major mistakes in them. You know, one of my favorites was in 2005. Governor Schwarzenegger, you remember, called a special election to put a series of measures on the ballot. And there was one of his measures didn't actually end up on the ballot because it was a measure about merit pay for teachers, a requirement that merit be used as the sole criteria in giving teachers raises. And while the measure was out being circulated, there was a meeting in the Capitol that between some of the initiative drafters and some members of the legislative staff, at which one of my friends, who's one of the leading education consultants in the legislature, pointed out to the drafters that they had written the law in such a way that they had repealed all the California laws that make it possible to take child molesters out of the classroom. And so the Schwarzenegger people had to drop that measure because they'd already started circulating. It was too late to go back and qualify for redraft it and qualify for the ballot. So, you know, we ought to think about making our initiatives like the rest of our laws, have them more professionally drafted and vetted on the front end, give initiative sponsors the ability, once they qualify signatures, to either change their measures to correct mistakes or to cut deals with the legislature. And we should make it more flexible on the back end as well, that, like in other states, make laws passed by initiative just like other laws after the passage of a certain amount of time, so that they can be altered in response to conditions without having to go through expensive ballot measure campaigns. For instance, in 2009, you remember at a special election during the depths of the Great Recession, we voted on a series of, in a May special election, a series of measures, including one that would have altered some of the provisions of the original lottery law, to bring it up to date and actually make it possible for the lottery to gather more revenue for the state of California. The voters turned that down, but it was necessary. More than 25 years after the original lottery was passed, the legislature, even though 2/3 majority of the legislature by bipartisan agreed that the lottery should be made more modern, and more responsive to current conditions, but the voters, they had to go back to the voters, and the voters said no. So that's one of the series of changes we think we ought to make. Another one is regards to money. At least nominally, under our Constitution, the budget proposed by the governor and passed by the legislature is supposed to be balanced. We're supposed to pay for the government we want. The initiative and the voters operate under no such rule. Anybody can go out and qualify an initiative that requires either cutting taxes deeply in California or raising spending on particular programs. The justice mentioned the 3 strikes measure, which was passed in 1994, which has been subsequently enormously expensive. I mean, it didn't provide any money, to pay for it, but the prison population in California grew quite significantly as a result of that measure. People at the ballot are never required to explain how it is we're going to pay for the things that they propose to do. And so one of the things that we suggest need to do is to make initiatives that deal with money live by the same rules. That if you propose a tax cut or a program that increases spending, that you also, in the same measure, provide offsets so that the measure is budget neutral, so that it doesn't create a budget deficit for California. It's basically asking us, to not have something for nothing, and live by the same grown-up rules that we expect the legislature to live by, which they always haven't, but it is at least the ideal. We would also, in order to make the system more of a conversation, is to adopt what they do in Switzerland, which is where the initial direct democracy process really originally came from, and that is to allow the legislature, if a sponsor of a measure cannot, cut a deal with the legislature on a particular measure, as we suggest, to allow the legislature to suggest its own countermeasure on the same ballot as an initiative. So, for instance, take the example of the marijuana measure we voted on 2 years ago in 2010, the one that was proposed by Oaksterdam University in Oakland to decriminalize marijuana in California. To take that as an example, that measure would be on the ballot as, I can't remember, what number was that? Does anybody remember what number that was? But let's say 10A is the proposal from Oaksterdam University. And then the legislature would have the opportunity to say, well, we don't think that's the right approach to marijuana policy. We think there's a smarter way to deal with marijuana, to propose a countermeasure, which would be on the ballot as measure 10B, for instance. And then we would do what they also do in Switzerland, which is to ask a third question of voters, a 10C. If both 10A and 10B receive a majority of votes, which measure would you prefer to go into place? Now, the advantage of this is severalfold. First of all, it creates a comparative campaign. Your voters are not just voting on one approach to a problem. They get a choice between two different approaches to the same problem. So the campaigns would be less about emotion, which is, as David points out, we do emotion very well. We really like those arguments over social policy and morality, gambling and sex and drugs and rock and roll. But a comparative, two different measures would force us to think about not just do we want to legalize marijuana, but if we want to legalize marijuana, in what way should we decriminalize it? What's the smart approach to it? That we'd have a comparison of different policies. And then for voters who don't like the idea of decriminalizing marijuana at all, the C question would allow them to do something other than vote just no, because you would have an opportunity to say, well, if those crazy people in California actually approve either A or B, which one do I think I don't like either of them, which one do I think is the better if one of them has to go into effect? Voters get more choices. We have a conversation about policy, and not just a conversation that deals with things in 30 seconds about emotion. And one other thing that I would recommend that the League look at, and this isn't in our book, but because it's something that's come up since we originally wrote it, is to look very closely at what Oregon, which is the only state in the country which uses the initiative more than California, the process they've created up there called the Citizens Initiative Review Process. And in Oregon, support the measure, and then they break up into teams of no and yes, and they actually write the arguments for the ballot for their fellow citizens from a citizen's perspective, not the kind of canned arguments that we get on our ballot pamphlet, which are carefully focus grouped by political consultants, to have sex appeal and emotional appeal, but arguments, drafted by real citizens who are like yourselves, who are trying to confront the problem. Oregon has started in this process. It seems like it's going to bear fruit, and certainly creates more of a citizen deliberative element in a process which, particularly in California, in which money, emotion dominate, and the original intent of the initiative process, which is that citizens with their deep experience with problems should actually deliberate and make informed decisions. So I'll leave it there. There are a bunch of other things in our book. We have a whole chapter devoted to ways to change constitutional amendment, et cetera, that we think offers a way for California to actually have to realize the promise of what Hiram Johnson and the progressives set out to do, and fit it and make it work with the rest of our government. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. And maybe before we open it to questions from the floor, I saw David writing there. Maybe he and Justice Ardaiz would like to add something.
I guess that there were two things, and I thought there were some great points made here. The first is, how would you feel about a national initiative or referendum at the national level, where Americans voted the same time we voted for president, for the death penalty nationwide, or for abortion politics nationwide, or something like that? By show of hands, how many of you feel that you would be okay with your fellow Americans across the country having a national referendum that would then hold in all 50 states? Would that be constitutional? Yes. Well, how to implement it, we'll get there. But just how many of you feel comfortable with such a national initiative? Not too many folks, right? So why do we feel comfortable with ours then? And if that's the case, then I think if we consider what's happening, I know people try, but why? So I'm not quite sure. So I was just thinking about, if we think about the initiative objectively, not as our own, but if we look at the initiative process or referendum from a theoretical standpoint and looked at it at different levels of government, how do you feel about Measure Z here, protecting the zoo, or other things that are sort of cousins to the initiative and referendum process? We might feel comfortable, but when you think about it in a more abstract way, most people are not very supportive of having their fellow citizens vote on these issues, or feel it might be hijacked. So that's one thing that came to mind. And then I was not familiar with the Oregon Citizens Initiative Review. I love that idea, and I'm going to find out more about it too.
Would you like to?
Well, I was just thinking about the question that was asked about a national referendum, and I think part of your reaction probably goes to the fact that in terms of the nature of our government, we're really distinct states. We operate separately, and so to the extent that we operate collectively, we operate under a constitution. So you would really be talking, we've always more or less taken the position that with respect to matters of national impact that affect how we protect this country, matters of national defense or collective issues, roads and whatever, that those are handled at a national level, but at a local level, meaning at the statewide level, we operate independently. And this is one of the things that really creates conflict in terms of our states and individual questions of morality, for example, and whether the morality that folks express, let's say in a state like Georgia, it would be the same as what would be done in New York or California. And so I would say that generally speaking, we tend to retain our independence as states. If we were going to go to national referendums, that type of thing, it would impact how we collectively view our government and the function of our government. which might be what is provoking the response that you see out there. The other thing I was listening to, and we were talking about things like costs, and I would take issue with you. 3 strikes did not raise the prison population in California, but when you're talking about things like costs, to me the troubling aspect of this is this, and I have. It's been my opportunity or my misfortune to work with the legislature over the years and also work in the initiative process. So I've seen both of them. And I think that with respect to issues in terms of what things cost, I would agree that to pass an initiative without essentially having to express how it is going to impact other laws, there's a lot of downsides to that. If we look at something like Proposition 13, Proposition 13 had a dramatic impact on our ability to finance things. And so necessarily we have a pie, and it's only so big. And so if you eliminate the amount of money that's coming in, or you change the way things are spent with, for example, schools, and you say 50% is going to go here, you necessarily restrict your ability of your legislature to respond. That's not necessarily a good thing. But on the other hand, speaking from a more generalistic standpoint, it does allow the people to express what they view as the priorities of government. And to the extent that they have to live with it, well, they have to live with it if they don't like the consequences. So, you know, there is a tension that exists there. And in terms of the legislature and the legislature's ability to assess what is or is not going to be a financial consequence, well, I mean, I'm just going to make an editorial comment that I'm not completely convinced that they pay that much attention to it either. But I think that we have to bear in mind the fundamental issue, which to me is, are the people going to have the ability to express their views with respect to how the state should be run? And is that going to be the dominant or the trump factor with respect to a law? And I really do think that at a certain point there is a level of frustration which people can express through the initiative process. And I think that's a positive thing. I'm not saying that all the policy is good. I'm not saying that people pass laws that really consider carefully rules of constitutional construction or rules of statutory construction. But generally speaking, I think they express a point of view that they're trying to get across, and they usually get it across pretty emphatically. I think if the process addressed those needs legislatively, you wouldn't really see the reaction in terms of the initiative. And maybe I'm being particularly optimistic about that, but that's how I feel about it.
Do we have some questions? I have let me start. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, well, I think you've got a very good point on different states in our country having an independence, because as you just mentioned, California would be a very difficult state to be in agreement with much done in Georgia. And we see this especially in the morality issues. The idea of, I think that's would be a bad thing in terms of it could hijack presidential, especially if done during presidential election years, could hijack the vote. We saw that when Tom Bradley, as mayor of LA, ran for the governor's office and the gun initiative was on the ballot.
No, I think that's a really good point. I don't support the national initiative, but felt that it's worth thinking about in theory. And one of the issues for me is building on what the judge had mentioned too. I think our current legislature is diseased. I think the entire body is dysfunctional, diseased, and it's sick. It's literally sick. And because of that, sometimes you'll hear about, well, let's reform the legislature or have the charter convention to go change or Jim Boren, God bless him, I love the guy. He would call for the unicameral legislature sometimes. It's not the legislature itself. The idea of a representative democracy can work and has worked in this state many, many years. But the current people there are diseased by the ideology that is pulling them in various directions and the moneyed interest that is putting them in place. So the initiative and referendum is much more attractive because you can't get anything done in Sacramento. And the people that are there are beholden to interests that are not you and I, in my opinion. So if that were to change and we were to bring in people through the legislative process who could do things, I think the power of the initiative and referendum would by itself diminish because people would not feel necessary to go around Sacramento anymore.
I noticed that I was very uncomfortable with the notion of a national referendum mostly, and it occurred to me, because the further away you get from home and the larger and larger a process gets, the more influence money has and special interests have who can pay for such things. We can pass something in Fresno without spending millions and millions of dollars and having huge corporate interests behind it, but at the national level maybe that doesn't happen. And it occurs to me that, you know, if this was if the initiative was a response to corruption in the legislature and special interests taking over the legislature, I wonder if you'd comment a little on the fact that a lot of our initiatives recently seem to be special interest initiatives, sponsored by, you know, particular industries and or particular people who have hugely deep pockets and interests that they are promoting.
Well, that's certainly true, but it's always been true in California. It was interesting, that one of the measures on the ballot in November, you remember, was Prop 39, which was sponsored by Tom Steyer, who's a very wealthy hedge fund manager from San Francisco, and a lot of people talked about, this is an example of, rich people being able to, be the only ones who buy policy, et cetera. There was the Molly Munger measure, again, another wealthy person. But, Hiram Johnson's initial measures were paid for and put on the ballot, and the campaign was funded by Rudolph Spreckels, who was the sugar magnate from San Francisco. And if you go and look at the initiatives that showed up on the ballot, in the first decade or two after the initiative process was put in place, there are all these measures from various sorts of special interest groups. It's why, for instance, in California, every time we change the rules about regulating chiropractors, we have to go do it through the initiative process, because the initial thing was put on the regulating chiropractors was put on the ballot by doctors back in the 1920s. You're keeping chiropractors from competing with them. So this has always been true. The money has played a major role, and it's played an even larger role as California, as the population has increased, and the only way to really, the way we organize the initiative, and we could organize it differently, but the way we've chosen to organize it is in a way that we do initiatives through 30-second television ads, that cost millions and millions of dollars to spend. We could have it be a more grassroots, community-oriented process if we wanted to.
I was wondering what percentage of initiatives are overturned in court?
I don't know the precise answer to that, but I would say that it's probably very few. If you're talking about the initiative itself, the broad question, very few. If you're talking about aspects of initiatives, they almost all of them carry provisions which are called severability provisions, which means that if this particular portion is held unconstitutional, then the rest of the initiative is not affected by that. So, there may be bits and pieces, bites that are taken out of it, but generally speaking, I don't think you're going to see many initiatives. Probably the only one is Prop 8, in which it's integral. There's really no way to separate it.
Yeah, there are different issues. There's some state initiatives raise federal constitutional problems. So Prop 8 is one of those. The 187 back in the 90s limiting services for illegal immigrants was overturned in part by federal court action. The state courts have knocked down a couple on single subject rules in the past, but not many.
Just a couple of questions ago, the question of special interest influence was brought up, and I'd like to come back to that a little bit. I think we need to remember that special interests do not influence just the initiative process, that they influence the legislative process, and historically that's the reason why we have the initiative process in the first place. So I think also that we need to realize we are never going to come up with a perfect system, but we just need to aspire toward a more perfect system. And I think that's what today is all about. Toward that end, what if we were able to limit funding and maybe even organizational wherewithal to in-state actors only? Prohibit out-of-state actors. Is that possible?
No.
Why not?
Well, because we have the First Amendment to the Constitution, among other things. What is an in-state actor is Amazon Corporation an in-state actor, even though they haven't had much presence, but they sell things in California. I think the federal courts, you would not get the federal courts to agree to a state to prevent people from outside the state in some way in participating in the process.
What does the judge think?
Well, I think that that's probably an accurate response. I frankly resent when I see people that don't have any real operational effect in this state influencing us by infusing large amounts of money, but I don't think there's any way you can stop that. On the other hand, it would be particularly important, I think, for me, if I could see where the money is coming from with respect to an initiative. And I think that's an informational thing, and it doesn't really implicate the Constitution to say that, George Soros contributed 25% of the money that went for this. I hope that doesn't offend anybody, but he seems to be the major guy contributing all of that. I'd be happy if he'd contribute some to my personal fund, but the point being that I think that's informational. I think if we knew that, we could gauge where it was coming from and the degree of influence. I tend to favor high degrees of information to the public that is unbiased, and but I agree that we would be implicating serious constitutional questions, and so you may not like the answer, but sometimes that answer protects broader principles.
The eminent domain initiatives that were very popular in 2004, 2005, 2006 were mainly funded by a gentleman out of Colorado who was going into different states and putting these eminent domain initiatives on the ballot. Plus, if you're that wealthy an individual or that wealthy a corporation, you're just going to buy a piece of property anyway in California and call yourself a resident. So the concept that anyone would be out of state for too long is kind of silly, because they'll just make themselves in state if they really had a care about a particular problem that they want solved.
I was interested in going back to the opinion comment that we have a dysfunctional, sick legislature. And would you care to comment on the effect that term limits have on that, and the fact that term limits are themselves an initiative, aren't they?
Term limits were indeed brought to you pretty much by the National Republican Party when they were locked out of a number of state legislatures early on in the late 80s and early 90s, and felt that it would serve Republicans better to put term limits on state ballots. So there's no, I want to get this right, there's no state with the initiative and referendum that doesn't have term limits, and there's only one state without the initiative and referendum that has term limits. In other words, the legislature put term limits on themselves. And then, this was used throughout 90, 91, 92, all the way through Newt Gingrich's control of Congress in 94. That was one of the 10 planks of the Contract for America, was term limits, because it was a political tool that was used to have more elections and increase the possibility of Republican takeover of some state legislatures, and they were extremely successful. So there is my colleague Jeff Cummins in the back, who has studied term limits more than I have and may want to speak to this, but for the most part you won't find a political scientist who supports term limits in the same way that would you want to buy stock in a company if you knew that CEO had to be out in 4 years? Would that be a good stock for you to buy, a stable stock for you to buy? No, but people think that when they send their CEO up to Sacramento, putting a term limit on him or her will somehow keep them clean. And for the most part, this hasn't really rung true. The only benefit to term limits is there has been some churn that has allowed some minorities and women to enter seats in state legislatures that we would not have seen 20 years ago. In that regard, it's a positive. But when you take out the institutional memory that is required in places like Sacramento, term limits to me are not appropriate.
Another issue I'd like you to address. A lot of times the initiative process, and I think this is thematic of some other comments that have been made, are sufficiently obscure or nuanced that generally speaking they're hard to understand, and people are convinced by way of commercials or other ads that this is something that they can identify with. On the other hand, you have somebody speaking against the same initiative for other reasons. What say you to perhaps some objective voice being have the same amount of exposure as these paid-for advertisements? In other words, if we're going to have an initiative process, that there is a voter interest or a citizen interest in having some more objective viewpoint that can clearly demonstrate where the differences of opinions are and where these maybe nuanced messages that are included in the law or the proposed law are somewhat uncovered.
Right, yeah. I mean, if you think about the way process works in California, I mean, we have some of that already. Our ballot pamphlet, every measure has a nonpartisan analysis from the legislative analyst's office, that and generally considered to be a gold standard of objectivity in terms of helping people understand these things. And of course that goes to every voter, in the pamphlets. It's available to them. And then there are private, there are nonprofit organizations and others like the League. I mean, there are for-profit organizations that try to analyze these things. That's what we did at the newspapers. When I worked at the Sacramento Bee, we used to say that the editorial board in Sacramento were probably the only group of 6 people in the entire state who'd read through every measure, had talked to both the proponents and the opponents, and could explain to people the relationship between the measures in current law and the measures in each other, because frequently there's interaction between them. There is a lot of material available to people if they seek it out, but it's people have limited amounts of time and interest in dealing with these things, so it's not unsurprising that people make their decisions either, they take cues from the commercials. They take a lot of cues from groups. So for instance, when people look at the ballot pamphlet and they see that the AARP is opposing or supporting member, it gives voters cues as to what side they feel like they should be on. They take the advice of trusted people.
I just want to say that, yes, the League of Women Voters does have a very comprehensive information given out. We start off with, when I talk to groups, I start off with the Easy Voter Guide, which is a very basic introduction to the pros and cons. and then, to the propositions, and then I introduce our pros and cons, which are, again, unbiased analysis. And then I suggest that they look at the Secretary of State's ballot official pamphlet, because it is rather daunting, though. So I have one more question here.
I'm thinking of Prop 13 and 3 strikes. Would a sunset clause be advisable in terms of propositions? It would give the citizens an opportunity to see what that particular measure is like, and then in 5 years or 10 years, have to make a decision that they want it or they want to reform it at that point.
Well, what we've suggested is that, by way of the idea that after, say, like a complete legislative cycle, after we've elected a whole assembly and Senate subsequently, that anything adopted by initiative just be a statute. It'd just be law like any other. And if the legislature has either the courage or the political support to modify it in some ways, that they could do it, and perhaps not. Now, it's been suggested that that legislative passed laws have sunset too, and I think there's some merit to that in some instances. I mean, certainly there are actually some laws in California that that have been passed for 10-year periods, and then the legislature considers at the end of the 10 years whether or not they want to change it in some ways. But I think our idea is that the initiative in the legislature, whether if they have sunsets, they both ought to live by the same rules, so that the processes fit together, and you don't have one that's always trumping the other.
Now, how many taxes have actually sunsetted?
Well, actually, quite a few of them.
Really?
Yeah, well, I mean, for instance, Pete Wilson's had temporary tax increases in the early 1990s. They sunsetted. Arnold Schwarzenegger in 2009, the tax increases in the 2009 budget all sunsetted.
Going back to the question from a few minutes ago, would it be conceivable that the government should fund ads? The point there was how much influence these ads have on the voter. Would it be possible that the government should fund, say, proportional to the total amount spent by private interests in ads, and fund the nonpartisan analysis, say directly from the State Department on TV? Is this a conceivable remedy to letting the moneyed interests ads overrule everything else?
I couldn't see them getting involved, and I'm not sure who them would be, because sometimes you might have a governor, or who would be the face of those ads, and who would be the spokesperson to represent the government on that, I think would be tricky. And I'm not so sure, we would see it at the national level when we've asked people to check a box on their taxes to pay for public funding of campaigns and things like that. Some do, most don't. And even the candidates themselves don't always follow the rules for the public campaign financing. So I think that would make it even trickier who would pay for those ads.
I think maybe the answer is not to pay for ads, but for an initiative to kick off a deliberative process that would be better than the ads or more informative than the ads. For instance, holding meetings in Switzerland, for instance. I mean, when somebody qualifies an initiative for the ballot, the first thing that happens is in Switzerland they say, oh, the voters want to have initiated a conversation about that, and then there is public funding for different sorts of groups who have different points of view on the measure, and there's public funding for them to get their message out to people, to have a conversation about the question, because they take the initiative seriously enough to say, if people have signed the petitions, this means our people want to have a conversation about this subject, and therefore we're going to have a publicly funded part of the conversation. Now, that doesn't stop there being a privately funded conversation as well, but we in California, we basically have entirely privately funded, and we don't have to have that.
Well, and the other thing is, I'm not sure that we should ignore the fact that a lot of our voting takes place at a very visceral level, and there isn't necessarily a lot of acquisition of information. It's available. So you have a lot of people, I mean, I don't think I'm saying anything that's particularly shocking, that vote on things that know nothing about them, and they're reacting to what they believe it's going to do. I mean, one of the things that I was listening to when David was talking was he was talking about, for example, judges and retention elections for judges. Well, the reality is that there's huge voter drop-off for judges, and that's because they don't know who these people are, so they don't vote. Okay, fine, but the impact of that is there's a certain segment of the population that always votes no. It doesn't make any difference who's up there. So if there's significant voter drop-off, what would normally be 25 or a 30% negative vote suddenly becomes a 45 or 50% negative vote. It becomes a very dangerous vote. Nothing has changed. The people that are dropping off are the people that normally actually look. They're saying, well, I'm not going to vote on something I don't know anything about. I don't know who that person is, so I don't vote. The other people don't care who it is. They don't like judges, so they vote no. But they're going to vote no regardless. I tend to think that and I get a huge number of calls, and I suspect that the people on the panel also get them right before an election saying, well, what does this mean? And I've been asked to write editorials to explain, for example, what does this mean? So I tend to think that we should provide an informational response that is very succinct and quite truncated, that says, I mean, every initiative, I don't care what it is, it has a primary goal in terms of the consequences that can be put into a very succinct sentence, I think. Whether it will increase sentences on repeat offenders, or will decrease, or will limit a certain tax, or will do this, have this consequence. So the people can see that, and if they want to read more about it, it's all there. But I really tend to think that we should ensure at least a modicum of voter information that's readily accessible, fairly unbiased, and try and provide that. I mean, I think it's the reality of the American voter. But that's probably a very cynical position, but I mean, that's just what I think.
I wanted to ask another question about the dysfunction of the state government. Do you feel that the redistricting that was done can overcome some of the dysfunctionality we've seen in the last several years, or does term limits trump everything as far as ignorance?
I was really supportive of Prop 11 and said so publicly in 2008. So I am hoping that the changes to the redistricting process will bear some fruit, if not in this current Assembly or Senate, over the next 5 or 10 years, and will decrease some of the pressures for people running for office to, so quickly jump through to think about the next seat. And I feel like citizens commissions, which I think Arizona was the first one, but there have been a number of states who did these citizens commissions for redistricting, is the proper way to go. No offense to any judges in the room, because there was a point where Governor Schwarzenegger in 2005, in the 2005 reform package, put together a proposal to have judges participate in the redistricting, and I also did not think that was a bad idea. So anything that kind of takes it out of Sacramento is an improvement to me. So that's why I wasn't so. The commercials were horrific about judges doing,
I know,
political
black
things.
robes and the money,
right,
and all
right,
that.
And that they were going to, make it just as bad as the legislature would. But I don't believe that, because I believe they're adults, and I think they would, work to do the right thing and watch each other. I don't believe that about the legislature.
Well, there is an effort there. I will say that. Actually, I agree. I think that judges, but I think judges would make a really concerted effort, regardless of which side of the political fence they were on, to accomplish whatever the objective is. And I think we would be better off. I think removing it from that legislative process would be a better thing. And then it's a question of how you do it. But whether it's judges, one thing I do think is, I don't mean to sound elitist by this, I'm not a big believer in random selection of citizens to address major social issues or major political issues. I mean, the reality is that if you can see how complicated something like this is, and you really need to have a thought process as to how it should all work and what your objectives should be. And so I tend to think that it should be people that have some training in terms of adhering to objectives and looking at goals and looking at process, whether it's judges or other individuals. I think it should be more focused on that. I mean, I realize there's direct democracy, but I just think there's issues that crop up with that.
I don't know if this is working. I had a lot of comments and thoughts, but I want to say that I agree with a lot of what was said, and one of my key things is that I do believe that the voting public is typically ignorant. Part of it is because things are not written clearly. I have a degree in engineering. I'm very logical, grew up in a very intelligent household, and there are some times that I read the propositions, go, what are they trying to say? And so I know that when I see people like my last roommate who literally votes based on a 30-second commercial and does not even read the propositions, I know that's happening by a large degree. So we are being governed by ignorant people, being a lot of the voters. And I say that because we do vote emotionally, and if they aren't being able to read clearly and understand what those propositions are, then it's a failure right from the start. I just wanted to say that, and that there's got to be a better way to educate the voters. And yes, I believe that things have to be able to be changed, even if it did start with an initiative. I just don't believe the people or anyone who thinks, well, that was good enough 100 years ago. Well, 100 years ago isn't today. And we have to understand that as a community, whether it be your block or your city or your state. And when it comes to this issue of a national referendum, my thought is, on the one hand, you think, yeah, that would be great. But on the other hand, people don't want to give up their influence. Most people, if they could vote for just what's good for them, that's what they would do, without regard to the fact that their neighbor may be impacted. So anyway, my thought is that yes, we have to maintain the states, but even cities and counties don't always vote together on what's good for the whole community. It's just this street versus that street. And we have to think differently. So even though I have other comments, that's really all I wanted to say.
Probably should be the, Marie, you have a question? Sure. Oh, comment, okay. And I think this probably be the last one. Thank you.
I just wanted to comment on the influence of the press on people vote. In Connecticut, I was a newspaper man. Paper I was with, conservative paper. Whoever we backed editorially always lost. The candidates always lost because we were always backing conservative Republicans. However, we had a very high degree of victories on the propositions that we were supporting. People just didn't understand them, and they went with the newspaper's support. So I think that's showing the difference. So we continue supporting losers on one end, winners on the other end.
I think we owe a tremendous round of applause to our speakers panel. Thank you so much. You have given us one of the best and most informative workshops that we have ever sponsored in my memory, which is not that long of the league, but you know, it's a decade or so. So thank you so much. And as a very small token, we would like to give each of you a book, which there will be a quiz on next week.
That's very kind. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I have one for you too, Mark, just sitting over here. Thank you so much. It occurs to me that I told you at the outset I was going to tell you 3 things about the League. And did anybody realize I only told you 2? So I have to tell you the third one. And some of you who are not members may be sitting here today thinking, wait a minute, doesn't the League advertise itself as non-partisan? How come they're taking a stand on this particular issue, or they want to take a stand on this particular issue? So let me explain to clarify this. The League is nonpartisan in terms of never and not being allowed to support individual candidates or political parties. That is the sense in which we are nonpartisan. But with regard to issues, we are an education and advocacy organization. So what would we do if we were not to take a stand on critical issues? But we only do it after careful studies, such as we are engaging in now. So that's my third point. I do want to thank not only the panelists, but also Liz Shields, our Vice President for Voter Services, who led the study committee, which consisted of Jane Worsley, Mary Parrish, Patty Campbell, and help me out, Liz, there was another, and Terry Johnson. So we want to thank all those people very much. We also want to thank Mary Farber, who is one of our male members of the League of Women Voters and happens to be my husband, and he is writing this up for the voter today. We now have a wonderful opportunity. Mark Paul has brought copies of his book, California Crackup, here. They are at the back table, and you are welcome to purchase one for $20, cash or check. And Mark will be happy to autograph it for you. So this is an unusual opportunity. Please do take advantage of it. And thank you all so much. Remember that we're going to have a second workshop. The material will not be the same. The subject will be the same, but we will have 3 different presenters. Bill McEwen, who is the editorial page editor and columnist for the Fresno Bee. Pete Weber, who's a leading political organizer. That's putting it mildly, in Fresno. And the third person is Trudy Schaefer, who is the State League analyst for political issues.